Ishita, you should begin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar on Sustainable Development Goals and Multilateralism, Agenda 2030 and Beyond, organized by the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI. I'm Ishita Srivastav, and I work as a research associate here at TERI. We are joined today by an eminent panel of 10 speakers from different parts of the world. Professor Dr. Phoebe Conduri, Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh, Dr. Lynn Wagner, Dr. Guillaume Lafortune, Dr. Eric Gisman, Dr. Nabnita Rudra, Mr. Chris Garrow, Dr. Paula Van Haren, and Dr. Sabyasachi Saha. May I request all the speakers to switch on their cameras for a group photograph, please? It's done. Thank you. As we reach the midpoint of this critical decade for sustainable development, the question of whether multilateralism can still deliver on the promise of Agenda 2030 has become increasingly urgent. With only a few years remaining until the 2030 deadline and against the backdrop of a rapidly evolving geopolitical landscape, today's discussion is both timely and significant. It is now my privilege to invite Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri, former diplomat and distinguished fellow at TERI, who has served as India's deputy permanent representative to the United Nations and as a sustainable development negotiator for India, to deliver the welcome remarks and set the context for today's discussion. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Ishita, thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, Ambassador Puri, you're audible.
Yeah. Ishita, thank you very much. Dear friends from across the world and across India, some of the most important organizations involved with work dealing with energy, resources, as well as sustainability. I'm particularly happy to see Dr. Ghosh here from ORF, my dear friend Sabyasachi from RIS, Nabanita from Development Alternatives, and of course, all my colleagues from TERI. So friends, you all know TERI. We've been there for 52 years, perhaps one of the oldest organizations in the developing world focused on energy, on resources, climate change, and sustainability. And we were very privileged that our first Director General, Dr. Pachauri, was the chair of the IPCC when it was awarded the Nobel Prize. This sort of establishes us, and we are very privileged that we are joined by such wonderful people from all across India today. But I also want to say a very big thank you to all our colleagues from around the world. And I don't want to take up much of your time, but I want to say something to you as somebody who was part of the negotiating process leading up to Rio Plus 20, then the SDGs and this entire business of Agenda 2030. The atmospherics in the world at that stage were such that climate change had reached a point where everybody recognized its importance and the need for the globe to come together and do something. What were the issues that we were actually, let me say, negotiating about? And I'm not using the word fighting about, but negotiating about. It was the kind of policy space. Me coming from a developing country, I sought to have maximum policy space to be able to grow and develop using the technologies which were then available. For the developed world, there were issues of historic responsibilities. There were issues of, we can't be the sole guys cutting down. China, India, Brazil, the BRICS countries, all of you are contributing. Your numbers in aggregate are going up. So these negotiations were about that. But I dare say, as we reach today, 2026, and it's time to start focusing on the post 2030 agenda and SDGs or whatever we call them after this, on each of these. And why do I say that? Because it takes time. That's one side of the story. But secondly, because in the world, we are facing a lot of pushback from sustainability. It isn't just President Trump who believes that climate change is a fake and who has said so in the UN General Assembly, who has asked his country to stop participating in the UN processes, who are defunding science on climate change. But if you don't mind my saying so, and I say so with due humility and respect to my European colleagues who are here, even within Europe, one senses a degree of fatigue with climate, with sustainability, and each of these factors. I am, of course, fully conscious of national security requirements, the needs of those countries in terms of budgetary allocations and so on. But at the same time, let me just point to the features which are there every day on television. No major TV channel in the world begins its program nowadays with anything other than covering the fires raging through Europe. Let's understand, therefore, that it's not just people like us in the developing world who are going to face the consequences of climate change and the need for sustainability. And therefore, should undertake mitigation, that's fair enough, but the need for adaptation, which is something on which all of us simply say, oh, but that's a local issue. Is it the entire continent of Europe being engulfed? You remember the wildfires in the United States? And I'm just giving you examples which really hit home and come to you. We've always left adaptation out. There's something called the global goal on adaptation, no one knows. But what do I want to leave to all of you? I want to leave 2 points to everyone. To all my colleagues from India who are coming together, I think it is high time that we started coalescing together in India and the global south. The BRICS summit is a very good opportunity for all of us to try and tell the world that the agenda of sustainability is not an agenda that you can look around, that we can forget about, that we can do at our own pace. Its urgency is very much there. We all need to focus on it. What do we need for it? Of course, we need finance, we need technology, but above all, we need collaboration and a willingness to tackle it. That's most important. And let us be very clear, the global south knows it, but it needs to come together and have its voice in a strong manner. Insofar as the developed world is concerned, what do I have to say to them? I have to make one simple point. We understand that the world's largest economy has a certain political perspective at the moment, but that's not the only perspective. Europe, which is a continent with as much GDP as the United States, has tremendous abilities and tremendous capabilities in technology, in money and finance. All of us, the India, look at what we are doing on the hydrogen mission. Look what we've done on the solar mission. As a result of India's actions, the world today feels, in the developing world I'm talking about, feels that solar energy is a doable thing, it's affordable, and why can't I do it? The International Solar Alliance, each and every one of them, the CDRI that we've done. We've done our bit and we are doing much more than what we can. But everybody needs to come together. That's it. To our friends in the developed world, please keep up your stakeholding. Please be strong. We understand that your governments have slightly shifting priorities, but keep them focused and use this particular needs to focus that it's not just mitigation. It's not just mitigation that we all need to focus on. We all need to also remember that every one of us, including in the developed world, has to undertake adaptation. And the sooner we evolve technologies, we evolve standards, the better it will be for all of us. Frankly, sustainability is not an option. Sustainability is an imperative. And can we do without all of us working together in global governance coming together? The answer is absolutely no. And so, therefore, it's time that we started. We, from Terry, the global South, India, we will do our bit. But we hope and count on our friends from across the developed world who see the importance and the imperative of sustainability. Please put your hands together, your minds together, and let's get going. Negotiations is a different matter, but negotiations do not mean that you don't end up with good and meaningful results. They may not be the best, but you can't look the other way because there's no option. It's an imperative. We need it for ourselves, we need it for our future generations, and believe me, we need to do all sides of it to ensure. On the SDG agenda, of course, we also need to be mindful that many things that we started off with the MDGs we didn't fulfill. We still have global hunger. We have issues of poverty in terms of medical sciences. COVID was such a major thing that struck us in the face and showed to us that should we not do things together. So each of those is important, but I want to keep myself focused on sustainability since it is facing, in a sense, the greatest pushback. But it's an imperative that we all need to focus. I wish the webinar all the very best. I will endeavor myself, along with my colleagues in Terry, to try and see what we can do within our country in India, within the global south, and try and take all this forward. But we count on our friends and the stakeholders in the developed world. You are particularly important. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Puri, for that insightful opening and for framing the stakes so clearly for us this afternoon. I will now deliver the framing presentation on behalf of Terry, which aims to lay the foundation for the panel discussion that follows. Is the presentation visible?
Yes, Ishita, it is.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So, adopted by the United Nations in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals set out a universal commitment to end poverty, protect the planet, advance peace and prosperity for all by 2030. This presentation traces their evolution and examines the achievements, limitations, and possible pathways for shaping the global development agenda beyond 2030. Let us now begin by looking at how the SDGs emerged. So the sustainable development journey began with the 1972 Stockholm Conference, which placed the environment at center of international discussions. In 1987, the Brundtland Commission connected environment and development through the principle of meeting present needs without compromising that of the future generations. Agenda 21, adopted at the Earth Summit in 1992, integrated the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of development. MDGs added measurable and time-bound 8 goals in 2000 with specific focus on reducing extreme poverty and improving basic development outcomes. Next, in 2002, in Johannesburg Summit, renewed attention was drawn to implementation and partnerships. In Rio Plus 20, in 2012, the SDG process was launched, and it is also established the high-level political forum, which is the UN principal body looking on how the SDGs are progressing. Next, in 2015, the Open Working Group, established earlier by UNGA and IGN, intergovernmental negotiations, fed into the negotiations on the post-2015 agenda, and the 2030 agenda was adopted. We also see 2015 to be a landmark year for multilateralism in terms of other multilateral policy developments, like the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and also the Paris Agreement. The implementation for SDGs began on 1st January 2016. Next, we see SDGs as a milestone in multilateralism. Now, why is it that we say that? Because what distinguishes SDGs are 3 key features. First is that it is universal, applies to every country, not only developing economies. It is expansive, meaning it has brought more issues to the table, including energy, oceans, cities, and industry. It is goal-based and measurable because it brings 17 goals, 169 targets, and a shared indicator framework. Now, the framework's implementation logic links global agreement with national actions. Common goals provide legitimacy and direction. Countries translate them into national priorities, strategies, financing and institutional arrangements, and partnerships mobilize actors and resources. There are certain monitoring frameworks, including the Global Indicator Framework, National Indicator Framework, UN Annual Progress Report, and HLPF that help with the reporting for SDGs. Next, we see what has the SDG framework achieved so far. So this is observed through the voluntary national reviews, which is, and UNDESA provides information on this by stating that 402 VNR presentations have been undertaken since the HLPF at 2016. 190 countries and EU have gotten it reviewed. 148 countries conducted multiple VNRs, and 37 countries are preparing to present it in 2026. There are three key features that are there for the SDG framework. First is the national systems integration of SDGs. Next, it is the data capacity setting up and participatory nature of SDGs. So we see that countries have established SDG coordination mechanisms, national reporting platforms, and data sharing arrangements. VNRs have also helped to integrate SDGs into action plans and policies. For example, Spain's third VNR has informed the midterm review of its Sustainable Development Strategy 2030 and included an independent civil society assessment. Next, the SDG framework has also strengthened data systems. Between 2016 to 2026, SDG database indicators increased from 115 to 233. Data records have also risen from 330,000 to 3.2 million. So every SDG indicator now has an agreed statistical methodology. Participation, in terms of participation, VNRs are voluntary, state-led, and open to stakeholder participation. And the participation spans across government, civil society, and the private sector. Next, we see how far are we from the 2030 targets. As per the UN SDG report 2026, the 12% of the targets are on track or have been met. 43% are on a moderate progress track, and 14% have been stagnated across assessed targets. 12% have regressed or gone back. 18% are not even being tracked due to lack of data. This slow and uneven progress must also be understood in the context of COVID-19 and the wider polycrisis context. Now we see that where the progress appears particularly concerning is in terms of three SDGs. SDG 6, clean water and sanitation. SDG 10, reduced inequalities. 14, life below water. And there are SDGs where there are serious data constraints in terms of SDG 5, gender equality. 11, sustainable cities and communities. 13, climate action, and 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. These data gaps weaken evidence-based policymaking and accountability. Moving on, we see a policy window is beginning to open. In terms of that, this timing is very significant for several reasons. Firstly, in 2026, it marks a decade of SDG implementation, provides substantial evidence on achievements and continuing gaps in targets, financing, data, and institutions. Secondly, it's the Pact for Future, which provides a forward-looking signal calling on member states to strengthen implementation of the 2030 agenda by 2030 and beyond. Next, we have the 2027 SDG Summit, which is expected to provide final heads of state and government review before 2030 and potentially initiate discussions on a follow-up framework. In 2027 September, we have the Global Sustainable Development Report, which is expected to provide an important knowledge output in this context. We see that although the post-2030 agenda process is not yet formally defined, but this creates an opportunity to consider what should be retained, revised, or strengthened. Next, we have the shaping of the post-2030 agenda, wherein we see that there are six big issues that need to be looked at. Firstly, we need to learn from the SDG experience, reflect on the design of targets, indicators, financing, data systems, and VNRs. Next, there needs to be focus on financing and means of implementation in terms of technology transfer, capacity building, institutional capability, and partnerships. Third, we have climate action, biodiversity, and conservation, which need to be more effectively integrated. Fourth, the framework should address emerging technologies, including digital transformation and artificial intelligence, and their implications for development and governance. Fifth, multilateral reforms should consider whether existing institutions provide sufficient coordination, representation, and accountability. Finally, equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities must remain central, particularly from a global south perspective. Next, we have the three pathways beyond 2030, which we envisage. SDGs, we believe, should continue. Deliberations need to focus on new issues, scope, timelines, and institutional arrangements for post 2030. We see that the first pathway is incremental reform, which would retain the broad SDGs architecture while revising targets and timelines, potentially extending the horizon to 2050 and incorporating emerging issues such as artificial intelligence, digital governance, and planetary boundaries. Building on the existing architecture may make it comparatively more feasible. Second, we have continuation, which talks about existing framework that would extend beyond 2030 with updated targets, timelines, and possibly refined indicators, while its goal and its institutional arrangements remain largely unchanged. This would offer continuity and avoiding negotiating a new framework. Next, we have the transformative reform involving deeper institutional changes, stronger mandates, mechanisms beyond voluntary reporting. So while transformative reform may better address structural weakness, it would require greater political consensus. Next, we have the guiding questions. I leave you with the guiding questions. First, what should be the core priorities of a post 2030 sustainable development framework, particularly in carrying forward the unfinished SDG agenda? Secondly, how should the framework address gaps in financing, technology access, data systems, voluntary reporting, accountability, and implementation across national and subnational levels? Third, which pathway is most likely and desirable from a global south perspective? Incremental reform, continuation with revised targets, or transformative reform? We hope today's discussion will contribute to shaping a more equitable and implementable and future-oriented global development framework. Right. So moving on, we now come to the heart of today's webinar, a panel discussion. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this session, Dr. Shelley Kedia, Senior Fellow and Director with the Center for Sustainable Development Research at TERI, who will steer the conversation. Over to you, Dr. Kedia.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ambassador Puri, for setting the context, and thank you, Ishita, for the framing presentation. Let us move on to the panel discussion, and I've been very much looking forward to the panel discussion. I would just like to add my own good afternoon and hello to everyone who has joined us, and would like to add my own welcome to all our distinguished speakers as well as attendees. Happy to see that we have about 288 attendees who have joined us through the webinar link as well. So thank you so much for taking out the time. We are, of course, undoubtedly meeting at a very important moment. The SDG implementation, as was also highlighted by Ishita in her framing presentation, started in 2016, and now 10 years into the implementation phase, the world is quickly approaching 2030. With progress that remains far too slow and uneven. The question is not simply what comes after 2030, but what kind of framework can retain ambition while addressing weaknesses in implementation, financing, coordination, and accountability. The choices could range from continuing the current framework with revised, perhaps some more targets, revised timelines, to incremental reform, or to a more transformative institutional change. As was already highlighted in the framing presentation, the more transformative the agenda becomes, there would be, of course, the political feasibility might also reduce. So there might be an inverse proportionality attached to it. I just want to again come back to the audience. The audience response and registration process also helped shape today's discussion. We received 127 questions through the webinar registration form, and these have been factored into the questions for our speakers. These questions broadly fall in 5 clusters. First, the future of multilateralism itself, which has been quite challenged today, especially amid poly crisis and the current geopolitical and geoeconomic turmoil. Second, the experience of Agenda 2030 and SDGs, what has worked and what did not. Third, the possible timeline, number and scope of future goals and targets, including Global South issues such as finance and means of implementation. Fourth, emerging priorities such as artificial intelligence, but also indigenous knowledge. And also, how do we look at greater integration across sectors? Fifth, whether the global north should face stronger accountability and how can multilateral institutions help in this? So now coming to the panel discussion, but before that, the SDGs gave us 17 goals and 169 targets. But in today's panel discussion, we have only 2 rounds with 4-minute limit per question. And this will test our collective commitments to the implementation in this current context. I will now invite our speakers in the order listed in the agenda. As mentioned before, each speaker will have 4 minutes in each round. So coming to our first speaker, Professor Phoebe Kunduri. Professor Kunduri, welcome. Just a brief introduction. Professor Phoebe Kunduri co-chairs the Independent Group of Scientists, or IGS, preparing the Global Sustainable Development Report, which will be out in 2027, GSDR in short. She's also a professor at Athens University of Economics and Business and has many other affiliation, which is already there on her background, and has worked extensively on systems thinking, linking nature, economy, and society. Professor Kunduri, my first question is, what priorities are emerging for GSDR 2027, and how can the report shape the final push towards the Sustainable Development Goals, with the timeline for which is 2030, and the discussions on the framework beyond 2030? Over to you, Professor Kunduri.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. And indeed, thank you for a lovely summary presentation of the history of the SDGs, together with the inspiring message of from the ambassador. Now, as you all know, the global SDR is the United Nations flagship scientific assessment on global sustainable development. Our mission, and when I say our, I mean the mission of the independent group of scientists assigned by the General Secretary of the UN to write this report, is to synthesize the state-of-the-art evidence from natural and social sciences from all regions across the world, in order to provide a reflection of the universal, indivisible, and integrated nature of the SDG agenda of 2030 agenda. The global SDR has been requested by all UN member states as part of the global follow-up and review of the 2030 agenda. Is prepared every 4 years, and we are assigned to provide an assessment of assessments of global sustainable development, trends, emerging issues, challenges, opportunities, lessons learned, relevant to the implementation of SDGs. But this one, the 27 report, is also increasingly crucial and important with regards to shaping recommendations for the Beyond 2030 agenda. Now, our narrative as an independent group of scientists is a positive one with regards to the SDGs. The SDGs represent a science-based, human-centered, comprehensive framework for transformation towards sustainable development. And a lot has been achieved, some of which has been already shown in the keynote speech. 196 countries signed, 193 submitted VNRs. There are major reforms across the globe of policy frameworks to align with the SDGs holistic framework. And on average, we have 20% of implementation on the ground. Now, the key challenge is that while the SDGs provide direction, there is no robust structure, explicitly tasks with driving their implementation at scale on the ground. So what we need is to operationalize the SDGs and create a system of accountability with regards to their implementation. We need operational global commons that create the capacity, the transparency, the accountability, and ensure effective, fair, equal coordination to deliver the SDGs on the ground. To that effect, we propose open access digital global commons where all the data, all the modeling, all the recommendations and platforms for stakeholder participation allows the implementation per country and also at different scales of a three-step approach. One that in the first step allows measuring where we are in terms of the implementation of the SDGs. In the second step, we co-design in digital twin modes the transition pathways of each and every country towards achieving the SDG, that is towards achieving to close the gap between what we have achieved today and what we want to achieve in the next 15 years, 2045. And this requires a science systems approach combined with stakeholder co-design. And step 3 is the communication, the development of portfolios of investments and transformations that will allow the implementation of the derived pathways for the transformation towards achieving the SDGs. And these investment portfolios and transformation portfolios are costed, and their financing with blended finance, public and private finance is discussed and recommended explicitly. Let me go through 7 propositions, recommendations for delivery of SDGs until 2030 and their continuity beyond 2030. These are very preliminary draft that they by no way convey what will be the final written text of the SDG global SDR, but they give our way of thinking about the up to 2030 and beyond 2030. First, protect the foundations of transformation. Peace, human rights, regenerative resilience are tests for every pathway, investment, and reform. Second, move from goals to integrated pathways. Build costed, territorially grounded portfolios that connect all 6 entry points have 5 levers, and this is wording from the previous SDRs, and I'm referring to the entry points and levers for systems transformation. Third, preserve continuity without stagnation. Avoid the 2030 cliff edge. Retain the universal integrated and rights-based framework while improving delivery. Fourth, institutionalize science-based solution pathway. Connect public institutions, modeling interoperable data, open science, and stakeholders co-design. Science has most of the solutions and it has the capacity to create the pathways, but science is not institutionalized enough in order to become the driving force or the designing force together with all stakeholders in order to accelerate the transition. A lot of barriers come into play, especially if you get in the international and national policy and political discussions. Fifth, rebuild fiscal space and redirect finance. Following the Seville UN conference, anchor delivery in public and concessional finance, make regenerative resilience material to decisions. 6, make justice and planetary integrity design criteria. Assess distribution, care, rights, and ecological limits without reducing all value to a price. 7th, cover frontier technologies in the public interest. Use risk-tired safeguards, independent assessment, and ecological and human limits. And finally, make accountability trigger correction. Link evidence, participation, and review to budgets, finance, regulation, remedy, and follow up. So we need a continuum of evidence, deliberation, pathways, budget, finance, delivery, and accountability in a framework that respects equity and human rights. I don't think we need to waste energy on designing further the goals. We can refine and improve them, yes, but what we need to focus all our energy on is implementation, implementation, implementation through collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kunduri, and this has been very insightful. And what the key takeaway which I have is that JSDR will infuse a sense of optimism with these possible preliminary 7 propositions that you have shared. The headline messages is that we need to, of course, preserve continuity, retain and improve, and implementation. Implementation is, of course, that's something which can't be emphasized enough. So thank you again. I now come to the next speaker, Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh. Welcome to you, Nilanjan. Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh is Vice President at the Observer Research Foundation, ORF, and is a leading environmental economist and a geoeconomist. The question to you, Dr. Ghosh, is how should a post-2030 agenda account for geoeconomic interdependence? We've seen enough disruptions, including supply chain disruptions and other systemic risks that cross national borders. Over to you, Dr. Ghosh.
Thank you, Shelley, and thank you, Terry, for the invitation. Thanks to Ambassador Puri for such a candid and articulate and provocative opening and succinctly placing the fault lines in the bold and articulate manner as he always does. And that actually creates a critical entry point. So, Dr. Kedia, responding to the question, and of course, by the geopolitical disruption, I presume the one that you were mentioning at this juncture is definitely the Hormuz which should not, definitely that's not a one-off energy shock, but a stress test for the post-2030 development architecture as such. And if we look at the present SDG framework, it's very clear that it was designed around a relatively linear pathway of progress. But the world beyond 2030, as we can already make out, is not going to be linear as such. It is going to be characterized by repeated interacting disruptions. We are going to have conflicts, probably much more intensified conflicts than we see today. Climate extremes. There are going to be technological displacements. The signs are already visible. Demographic change, we are going to see debt stress, we are going to see some supply chain fragmentation. As such, we are already living through a polycrisis, as you rightly mentioned, Shelley. This does not simply mean that several crises are occurring at once. It means that risks interact, amplify one another, and produce consequences greater than the sum of individual shocks. So that really makes it a complex problem. And by complexity, all I mean is that the solution, so the problem by itself cannot be expressed in the framework of the ordinate and the abscissa, in the x-axis and the y-axis. Rather, it's neither. In fact, it's a complicated problem which can essentially be decomposed into simple problems. So Hormuz shows us what interaction actually looks like in practice. A shipping shock becomes an inflation shock, an inflation shock becomes a fiscal shock becomes a development shock. And India's exposure illustrates this transmission. Of course, we actually did pretty well. If you look at the overall situation, we have been importing approximately 85 to 90% of our crude oil and more than half of our natural gas. Now, instability around Hormuz, therefore, in fact, raises not only the price of oil and the freight rates, insurance premiums, hedging costs, transaction costs, inventory carrying costs, but these pressures over time, if at all, in fact, things keep on persisting, it is going to travel through the current account, the exchange rate, and the domestic prices. So there is also an important lesson in the composition of dependence, because we have, of course, diversified sufficiently for roughly 70% of our crude imports to be routed outside the Hormuz. Yet we are still importing 60% of our LPG, and approximately 90% of the LPG actually pass through the strait. So aggregate diversification can therefore conceal product-specific and socially critical vulnerability. Now, recently, in fact, I developed this commodity service transmission framework that explains why consequences travel so widely. In fact, they often move through commodities, the oil, gas, fertilizers, and petrochemicals, then through logistics, that is freight, insurance, delivery delays, and then through finance, then in fact through the services. What happens is large component of these shocks are often absorbed by the firms, by the importers. The uncertainty also changes behavior, but because geometrically speaking, firms can defer investment, households reduce consumption, governments lose fiscal room for maneuvering. So inflation scenarios due to closure of Hormuz can actually illustrate this amplification had the pass-through happened to the consumers. So in fact, a 50% pass-through, if that at all happens, India's headline inflation could rise to around 5.6%, whereas our threshold inflation, that's the tolerance limit, happens to be 6%, as far as the Reserve Bank of India is concerned. Now, who carries this loss? If households absorb it, purchasing power and consumption decline. If farms absorb it, margins, employment, and investment suffer. If the government absorb it through subsidies or tax reductions, fiscal space for health, education, infrastructure, climate adaptation, social protection contracts. So the economic cost doesn't disappear. It migrates from tankers to company balance sheets, to public budgets, to household tables. So the lesson from Hormuz is much larger than any of the present decade, as resources are increasingly being diverted from development to defense. Military expenditure, of course, has reached 2.7 trillion US dollar, while developing countries are still facing an SDG financing gap to the tune of almost 6 to 7 trillion US dollar, and more so because something that Ambassador actually mentioned. Look at the adaptation financing gap for the developing world. The annual adaptation financing gap, as per the adaptation gap report, is to the tune of 365 billion US dollar, whereas we have been able to mobilize barely 28 billion US dollar annually. Now, peace and institutional instability are therefore not simply one SDG among 17. They are enabling conditions for the entire development agenda. Nor will the future systemic risks arise only from war. We have to realize that. Climate change will generate repeated supply side shocks. The years 2015 to 2025 were the 11 hottest on record, with extreme heat, floods, and cyclones already disrupting interconnected economies. Yet, what are we mobilizing in the name of adaptation? And there is also a clear bias that we find, in fact, with the multilateral financial institutions, because you were mentioning about the international financial architecture. And around 85 to 90% of the financing from the multinational financial institutions, as also, in fact, large parts of the developed world are getting into, in fact, in mitigation projects and energy transition projects. This is precisely because in most of these projects, they can find a perceptible ROI, a return on investment. And in most of the adaptation projects, they will keep on asking for bankable projects. Now, what does a bankable project mean? A bankable project essentially means that that we need a project which has a perceptible return on investment or an economic rate of return, which doesn't take into consideration the holistic social rate of return associated with essentially creating resilience. Now, on the other side, artificial intelligence will create a different form of economic transition, because if I recall the ILO estimates, it states that the 1 in 4 workers globally is employed in an occupation with some exposure to generative AI. Demographic change will create yet another divergence. Some economies will confront aging population and shrinking workforces, while others must create employment, housing, and public services for large and youthful populations. So by the late 2070s, people aged 65 and above are projected to outnumber those below 18 globally. India is going to have a population of to the tune of, I presume, 300 million above the age of 65 by 2050. So, which is, of course, size of more than the size of many nations. Now, these risks differ in origin, but they ultimately arrive through many of the same economic channels: production, prices, public finance, employment, investment, and household welfare. So the 2030 framework should make economic resilience a measurable development outcome and not a vague aspiration. First, every country should undertake a development resilience stress test. This should map exposure to energy and food choke points, concentrated suppliers, climate hazards, talking of critical technologies, financial contagion, and demographic pressures. Second, let me emphasize on this, that we should measure the durability of progress, not only the level of progress. It is not enough to ask whether poverty, health, energy indicators improved in a normal year. We need to introspect. We need to ask how much of that progress survives a war, a flood, a commodity price spike, or a technological disruption. Third, the framework should distinguish 3 dimensions of resilience: exposure, absorption, and adaptation. Exposure tells us where dependence lies. And then, in fact, when we talk about adaptation measures how absorption talks about the very physical space, the strategic reserves, social protection, the foreign exchange buffers, and of course the emergency liquidity. You talk about adaptation, that measures how quickly an economy can change suppliers, routes, technologies, skills, production systems. Fourth, resilience finance must become automatic rather than discretionary. We need to have contingent credit lines, disaster and shock clauses in date contracts, regional insurance goods, emergency trade finance, and concessional adaptation financing should be achieved by predetermined triggers, not negotiated only after development gains have already been destroyed. Fifth, we require redundancy without retreat. The answer is not autarky or indiscriminate globalization. It is managed interdependence, greater diversity of suppliers, greater diversity of connectivity routes, greater diversity of technologies, greater diversity of development and economic partnerships. So the objective is not to disconnect economies. The objective is to prevent one broken link from destabilizing an entire system. And for the global south as such, why I come to global south and the developing world, because Ambassador Puri actually mentioned of it, resilience cannot become another unfunded mandate. Countries that have contributed least to many global risks often possess the smallest fiscal buffers with which to manage them. The post-2030 agenda must therefore link resilience obligations to concessional finance, technology access, capacity building, and reform of the multilateral financial system. This is of absolute necessity. Hormuz was just a warning. A development architecture built for stable averages will not survive an age of recurrent tail risks. So beyond 2030, the central question can never simply be how fast an economy is progressing. Let's get out of this entire reductionist growth paradigm. It has to be, can the economy absorb the next shock without surrendering the development gains of the last decade? Because in a polycrisis, development that cannot withstand disruption is not sustainable development. Let me close it here.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ghosh, and thanks for reminding that durability of progress is also very important. Now we come to our next speakers, Dr. Lynn Wagner. Dr. Lynn Wagner has joined us all the way from Canada, so she's right there in the middle of the night. Thank you so much for taking the time out. To introduce Dr. Lynn Wagner, Dr. Lynn Wagner is a senior director at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, with extensive experience in multilateral environmental negotiation. As a researcher, I personally follow the Earth Negotiations Bulletins, and this is where actually I learned my ABCD. Before I got my first opportunity to actually witness the negotiations one-to-one. But welcome, Dr. Wagner, and thank you so much for joining us. So the question to you is, how do you expect negotiations on the post-2030 agenda to evolve, and where will the principal, political, and institutional challenges lie? Over to you, Dr. Wagner.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and really rich conversation already. Yes, so I work with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and particularly on projects such as the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. If you're not aware of it, we go to environmental and sustainable development negotiations around the world since 1992, and write reports on what the governments are saying to each other to help increase the transparency of these negotiation processes and these decision-making processes that are important for all of us. And so with that, we have a really rich kind of archive of the decision-making process up to present day, and really looking forward to continuing that for the decision-making process for the post-2030 agenda. I guess in terms of the process for how this new agenda is going to be developed, most eyes are on the 2027 SDG Summit, which is happening in September under the auspices of the UN General Assembly. And that the Pact for the Future said that would be the starting point. But you need to keep in mind that the drafting of the process for the declaration will be adopted there. And it's expected to take place among UN member states within UN headquarters in the months leading up to September 2027. So some of the discussions in the coming months are going to be equally important, or maybe even more important, because they will help frame what that process is going to look like. The co-facilitators, there'll be two two delegates, two probably permanent representatives, one from a northern country, one from a southern country, will be appointed probably end of 2026, early 2027. And so it'll be really important to keep an eye out for who those co-facilitators are, because they will have a big responsibility in helping to shape that decision that's going to be adopted in 2027 at the SDG Summit that will launch whatever this new process is. From September 2027 till maybe 2028, so that first year, because the expectation is that the new agenda will be kind of ready for adoption end of 2029. But so for that first year, 2027 to 2028, the kind of thought or maybe hope is that it'll be kind of stock taking consultations. When the SDGs were adopted, there were 13 sessions of the open working group that negotiated them. The first 8 of those 13 sessions were called stock taking sessions. So the delegates were briefed and engaged in conversations with kind of resource people who would come in and talk about different possibilities for SDGs, but they were really discouraged from discussing, the number of SDGs, what exactly they would shape, what they would take. So they were exchanging information about what challenges they each had and how, this goal would really be important or how it would work in our country, how these options might fit together. And so it would be really good to have that stock taking to evaluate, what did we have with the SDGs, the 2030 agenda, what has it meant, how important has been, what are the gaps, how do we fill those gaps? I guess another reason why it'd be really important to have maybe this stock taking period is because it's already been alluded to, the U.S. administration, current administration is not expected to take really a leadership role in this preparation of the new 2030 agenda. The election for the next administration will happen at the end of 2028. So the hope is that then maybe in 2029, there would be a different, leadership and different perspective from the U.S. and maybe abilities from others to engage and to maybe a different perspective within the UN of the member states. So for the preparation of the 2030 agenda, it's not necessarily expected that there will be another open working group, a negotiating body selected. And that is in part because there's a question of whether we would be reopening the SDGs and negotiating something new, or if we're, thinking more technically, or, how to combine and how to work and how to deepen the implementation. Some of those things don't necessarily need a full negotiating body. I guess, within that, there are very, very strong calls and recognition that there needs to be consultation. And so what shape would that be? There needs to be consultation, among stakeholders globally. There will be some sort of negotiation because there'll be some sort of resolution or decision coming out. How do those negotiators get informed by, this global conversation about what the SDGs were, how useful they were, where the gaps are? And so how will the co-facilitators manage this type of process is a big question. And, certainly they'll need to kind of invent and experiment as they go. And so I'm sure they'll be happy to have ideas or, thinking about what that would be. And so then the expectation in 2020 for 2029 would be this, finalizing the plan, kind of that final push to get to the what the agreement's going to be. And so the SDGs were negotiated, the OWG met always in New York at UN headquarters. And so then, should there be meetings around the world, or should it just be located in the UN in New York, which is increasingly, difficult to get to for cost reasons and for visa reasons and other reasons. How can those decision makers be made accessible to the world, and not just expect that the stakeholders would be able to fly in? I guess in terms of content for the new agenda, and maybe I should have led with this. I think the discussions at the July 2026 HLPF session revealed that there's really strong resolve to continue with the SDG framework, that there's a lot of countries and major groups confirm the usefulness of the SDG framework, and a willingness to continue with, I think, as all the other speakers so far have said, recognizing that there are gaps, there are limitations, there are areas where we really need to refocus and do, really thinking around how to do better. And I think, all of this is aimed at the need to implement, that how can we take what we have and really accelerate the implementation. And I guess just then in terms of some key actors, I guess as far as governments, during HLPF, there's a side event that that I attended that revealed that the Russian Federation is already organizing a process to coordinate what they call an Astana platform. So they had a meeting in Astana, Kazakhstan. So far, it mainly involved the Eurasian region, but they invited a few other countries, and there were some others involved. And they were really focusing on implementation of and thinking about the kind of administration of the SDGs, and said that they were proposing a shift in the focus to implementation of programs through the formation of coalitions and alliances of interested countries, financial institutions, major companies, and that I guess in my mind it sounded a lot like kind of creating some coalitions of the willing around some of the key issues that need to be implemented. I think they were talking a lot about kind of regional implementation, and so that I guess is definitely a process to follow, that they were very committed to developing this idea. And I guess just in terms of one other country, Germany has been really a leader for the SDGs. Their permanent representative helped, facilitate the Pact for the Future. They've been very active in developing VNRs and peer review processes around them. So I'd watch kind of what they're doing as well. And then just a few challenges. During this event where the Russian Federation presented its Astana platform, another speaker was listing out some of the things that stakeholders really could help with right now. And I thought it was really interesting that he said, that there needs to be this new theory of change for development, and that it would be really helpful to have that in the coming months, leading up to the SDG summit, helping to define what that the new theory of development that should underline this new new process, new 2030 agenda should be. And I think, the conversation so far has been alluding to the fact that there are these stresses and strains and the global architecture is under pressure. And within the UN, even there's the UN 80 reform where they're rethinking, what the change, the approach to development is. And so, being sure that there's a working model for what this theory of what the 2030, the post 2030 agenda is supposed to be achieving is going to be a really important conversation in the coming months, and getting agreement on that is going to be a challenge, and how to fit the 2030 agenda or the post 2030 agenda into this evolving conversation will be something that'll be really important to watch. And then I guess just one final challenge is kind of the fear of regression rather than forward movement, especially with the challenging multilateral landscape. And ensuring that we keep, the communities that have engaged and have developed their frameworks around the SDGs, to keep them engaged and to not say, we're abandoning the SDGs because we have this new thing. I think that would be a big risk of just completely losing them and their following the what the global development agenda is, and so how to connect what has come before and what has been good. There have been good things about the SDGs, to keep the momentum going forward and not inadvertently regressing instead of moving forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lin, and thank you so much for laying out what we can expect as we proceed, as we are nearing the 2030 timeline, and there will be a process. What we hear from you, it may not be as elaborate as was the case for SDGs with the open working group. We also had the Secretary General's high-level panel, and then, of course, towards the end, we had the intergovernmental process. But still, because again, maybe it's not about reopening, but maybe just improvising over it. So it may have some negotiations, the key role of the facilitators, also the other discussions which are ongoing, including the UN reforms discussions, will be important in the context of multilateralism. And we all look forward to following that. And also, of course, through the reporting of ENB, but also through your insights. And thank you so much for sharing those. We now come to the next speaker, Dr. Guillaume Lafortune. Welcome, Dr. Lafortune. And to introduce Dr. Guillaume Lafortune is Vice President and Head of Sustainable Development Solutions Network Asia, and has led major initiatives on SDG Index, as well as developed many sustainable development related dashboards. To you, Dr. Lafortune, what lessons from SDG measurement should shape the next framework, and which gaps in the current indicator system require particular attention in your understanding? Over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Shaili. And thank you in general to Terry for this wonderful webinar. I see we're still close to 300 people connected. So well done, Terry, for organizing a very good webinar, also for the insightful discussion. And also thank you to Ambassador Manjeev and to Priyambada as well. I would echo what Phoebe said. It's always useful, actually, to talk to people, first that were there in 2015, that took part in the negotiations, but also to put these discussions in the framework or in the context of more than 50 years of international negotiations and progress since 1972 in Stockholm. So I thought the introduction was very, very good. Shaili, you mentioned it. I'm Vice President of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. We are the largest network of researchers and scientists mobilized around solutions for the SDGs. We were actually set up 3 years before the expiration of the MDGs by the UN Secretary General at the time, Ban Ki-moon, precisely to do what we're doing here, which is to think about the next era of global cooperation for development. So at the time, a lot of our mission was around contributing to those discussions, what would come after the MDGs. And then once the SDGs were adopted, it was about supporting implementation by mobilizing research and science. And one of the ways that we do this, I mean, we do a lot of education, training, a lot of underground activities in universities and campuses, but we also monitor with our network every year the progress that the world is doing on this agenda. And this is summarized each year in a flagship assessment, which is called the Sustainable Development Report. It was released last June online. A few days ago, actually, in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, we had the in-person launch of this assessment. So Shaili, you asked me about some of the lessons. Lesson number one is we are at the global level very much off track. 16% in our estimate of all the targets are currently on track to be achieved. None of the goals are on track. There's major challenges on environmental goals, especially the biodiversity one, 14, 15, but also everybody faces challenges on SDG 2, Sustainable Agri-Food System. That's one cluster of challenge. The other one is around sustainable cities and communities. There are persisting territorial gaps in SDG implementation, but also a number of issues around air pollution and access to transports and so on. And then the last set of challenges, and I think this is no surprise to anybody, is around SDG 16, peace, justice, strong institutions, where there is actually reversal in progress over there. Where we see some good news is around access to basic infrastructure and services, like access to electricity or internet, for instance. Now, this is lesson number one. Lesson number two is this global average masks very different realities across goals. I mentioned some of the targets that are doing a bit better, but also regions. East and South Asia is, I would say, by far the region that has showed the strongest progress on the SDGs since 2015. We are here, and India actually progressed in our estimate by 18 ranks since 2015. China by 14 ranks. And in general, on average, this is a region that is making a lot of progress on this agenda. It's also the region, because we surveyed our member institutions on the ground contributing to SDG implementation. It's also the region where we see the most optimistic views on the evolution of the sustainability policy landscape and progress made. This is in opposition to a region like North America, driven by responses that we got from the US, where there's much more pessimistic views about how sustainability policies are evolving. Just to connect with the point made by Ambassador Manjeev at the beginning of the workshop around Europe, in our assessment, Europe is still in the lead when it comes to combining the three dimensions of sustainable development, economic and social progress, and environmental sustainability. There's a legacy to this. It's building on achievements from the past. But I would completely agree that when we look at the policy landscape in Europe, there is actually a watering down of many of the agreements and commitments that were made in the past, including of the European Green Deal. And we documented this in a flagship assessment a few months ago, working closely, by the way, with Professor Phoebe Konduri here, who is the co-chair of SDS in Europe, of course. So that's lesson number two, I would say, is, so lesson number one, we're not on track globally. Lesson number two, there are quite significant variations. The third point I want to make is that when we look at the commitment towards this agenda, and I think this is important because we're talking about upcoming negotiations and so on, there is still near universal consensus behind the SDGs. So one thing that we did last year is to go through all the UN General Assembly resolution that make a reference to sustainable development or 2030 agenda. There's more than 20 of them. Okay, those are resolutions about investments for sustainable development, education for sustainable development, ICT for sustainable development. Okay. The size of the majority that backs these resolutions is very strong and very large. We're talking about 170 or 180 countries backing these resolutions most of the time. And among the countries that don't back them, sometimes they abstain or they are absent. There's only a handful set of countries that are opposing very explicitly these resolutions. The United States of America is clearly one of them, and it's systematic. And then you can add Argentina, sometimes Paraguay, and Israel on average, countries like the US and Israel are the countries that vote the least alongside the rest of the international majority every year at the UN General Assembly. But the point here is that we don't see a strong opposition emerging against the paradigm of sustainable development, which I think should give us hope that a very large coalitions of the willing and countries will manage to come up with a shared agreement, not only on the framework, but also on the means for implementation. This is also, and this was in the presentation by Priyambada earlier as well, 190 countries have done VNRs, and every year we see more and more voluntary local reviews also being presented. So a very large momentum here. By the way, many voluntary local reviews in the US, because the lack of support at the federal level doesn't mean that the states and the cities, the universities are not still mobilized behind this agenda. Final point for me in this initial intervention on the data and metrics, we just hosted actually last week a workshop here in Kuala Lumpur with the Japan International Cooperation Agency on the post-2030 indicator framework. This is a 2 years collaboration that we have between SDSN and JICA. And there's 3 priorities here and 3 areas of work that we're focusing on. One is on a reflection about how to strengthen data availability and quality, notably by leveraging the potential of new technologies. I think there's a lot that we can learn from the past 10 years and how AI, but also GIS technologies and other technologies can be further leveraged to fill some of the persisting data gaps. The second point is around simplifying the indicator framework to better target some of the investments, but also to connect a little bit better the monitoring to the rest of the policy cycle. So we sometimes see the monitoring being done in silo and not necessarily connected with other steps of the policy cycle, including the planning or the budgeting, for instance, perhaps because working with 200 plus indicators is very challenging for government. So how to simplify this indicator framework. And then the third area of focus is how to make the accountability framework more effective and operational at all levels, including a reflection around the VNR process, the GSDR process, and so on. So I just want to, I'll stop here for this intervention, just to say that I would invite anyone here in the panel, but also in the call here, if you are interested on this topic of monitoring and accountability framework post 2030, we welcome. I mean, you can feel free to reach out to us. We plan to have a final report on this topic ready by 2028, either July HLPF or UNGA 2028. I'll stop here, Shaili.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laputu. And thank you so much for highlighting, I think, one of the points which is a key takeaway is to link indicator frameworks to policy cycles. Happy to share, we have attempted that in TERI by linking SDGs with budgeting processes. And I think many of the state governments, subnational governments have found it particularly useful in the planning. I would say that at least at this stage, it's more like a self-assessment and stock taking, but I think again, linking it to all stages of planning cycle, policy cycles is very important. So thank you again. And I come to the next speaker, Dr. Eric Zussman. Just to briefly introduce, Dr. Eric Zussman is also joining us from Tokyo, which is a little bit, I mean, it's at least getting a little later in the evening, but thank you so much for joining. Dr. Eric Zussman directs the Integrated Sustainability Center at IGES and works extensively on environmental governance and sustainability transitions. The question to you, Dr. Zussman, is how successful have the SDGs been in promoting implementation across different levels of government and governance, and where, according to you, are the major gaps?
Great. Thank you so much, Shelley, for this very important question. And I'm really delighted to talk to you on the governance of the SDGs, as I think in many respects, this is sort of the sort of missing piece, if you will. And I think, one of the things that we've seen throughout the intervention so far today is that there's been very strong recognition that the SDGs have helped change the sort of norms of how we deal with sustainability. And in, political science, where I did much of my doctoral research, We talk a lot about the integration and the interactions between norms, so ideas, and then institutions and interests. And I think what we're talking about now as we think about, post 2030 is really how we can move from changing the sort of ideational pieces or the normative pieces, um, and to from there to think of more about institutional change. And so, in terms of institutional change, I mean, I think we have seen some positive signs. So, in particular, we've seen some activity, obviously, with the VNRs at the national level, but as was also mentioned in the previous intervention, we've seen over 360 VLRs emerge somewhat organically from the local level. So I think one of the key questions is going to be institutionally, how do we link these processes from the national level or global level to the national level and then down to the local level? And this is particularly important because I think, a VLR is a very nice exercise to go through. Um, and similar to some of, what we see at the local level with climate change planning or biodiversity planning, I think this is also a very good exercise to go through for local governments. But a lot of times, even, uh, what we would consider, front-running cities lack the resources to actually implement what's written into these documents, plans, or reviews. So we need to think a lot about how to strengthen multi-level governance and strengthen institutions that work at different levels. And I think when we start talking about that, then I would like to make some important distinction. Um, there's been a lot of emphasis, of course, on multi-level governance and the importance of strengthening integration between different levels of decision making. But I think that one of the challenges or one of the things we're going to need to think more and more about as we move into post 2030 and as we focus more on implementation is how do different types of multi-level governance arrangements function in different types of countries. So let me give a clear example here. A lot of times when we think about multi-level governance, we're thinking about coordination and cooperation and how, basically national governments can transfer resources, maybe through fiscal transfers or whatnot, to local governments to help implement what some of their planned activities. But I think when we think about multi-level governance, it's important to draw a distinction between this type of sort of more cooperative, coordinated framework, and then frameworks that are a little bit more open and enabling and allow for more competition across different local entities. And so you have different types of models of multi-level governance, different types of institutional arrangements that can help facilitate implementation of sustainability initiatives, sustainability activities that might be specified, for instance, in your VLRs. So that distinction between different types of arrangements and a distinction between more cooperative and competitive types of multi-level governance arrangements, I think is going to be increasingly important as we think about contextualizing different types of implementation strategies. The second point that I want to mention in this connection is I think the implementation piece is really, really important. And I think governance is really, really important for implementation. Institutional change is really, really important for implementation. But I would add another word to this and another keyword, and that other keyword is scaling. So I think what we've seen, especially in Asia Pacific, my institute, the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, we recently released a report on synergistic solutions to the triple planetary crisis. And I think what we're seeing, more and more in Asia, and this was also referenced in the case of Europe, is a lot of good on the ground local examples of synergistic solutions to sustainability challenges, climate change, biodiversity, pollution control. But one of the key things moving forward is then how do we spread those solutions in a context appropriate manner? And so I think then this once again links over to the discussion of what types of institutional arrangements not only strengthen implementation, but also can support scaling across different regions, across even within different cities and or local governments. And I don't think we've put, when we talk a lot about means of implementation and institutions, I don't think we've put as much emphasis on the scaling question as we should have. And I think that's going to be incredibly important as we start thinking about post 2030. And, so maybe it's a story about, means of implementation, but also means of scaling. And I don't think those are necessarily the same thing. And so that's another piece of the equation. And then the last point I want to raise is when we think about multi-level governance and we think about the support that needs to come down to the local levels, one of the concerns that I have is that, and this was obviously a big issue that was featured in the current sustainability agenda, is this idea of, no one gets left behind. But one of my concerns is that smaller cities or smaller locations are not going to be able to keep up with some of the changes that we need and are going to be more exposed to crises and challenges. So I think we also need to make sure that as we try to strengthen multi-level governance arrangements, take different approaches, focus on scaling synergies, that we look at opportunities for bringing in smaller cities, smaller locations. Like we're working in Japan a lot with not only bigger cities like Kawasaki, but a smaller city like Hachinohe, city of 200,000 people. That's, it's one of these cities that's losing a big portion of its population due to an aging society and outflows of migration to larger cities. So, one of the questions I have is, how do we strengthen these multi-level arrangements so that these types of smaller cities can pursue their own sustainability path, and make sure that, they have like a much smaller group of people that are working on these issues. So how can we train up those smaller groups of people and create, coalitions within the city that can drive the sustainability transitions that we need? And where does multi-level governance fit for a smaller city like Hachinohe? So I'll leave my comments at that, but thank you so much for this opportunity, and I really appreciate everything I've heard so far. It's been very enlightening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zasman, and thanks for highlighting the fact that, yes, means of implementation are important, but scaling is also important. I recollect in a project which we had cooperated with the Institute of Global Environmental Strategies, IGS, and of course, you were the lead point. Before Rio Plus 20 was IFSD, because that was one of the strands of discussion, institutional framework for sustainable development. And we had undertaken a study on the emerging innovations for institutional framework for sustainable development on energy. Of course, that was the framework, and we looked across emerging practices across Asia. And of course, we had attempted to answer the scalability questions, but of course, it's still an important one. And thank you so much for your insights and highlighting all these key issues, which continue to remain important. And yes, we'll be very much looking forward to follow your work in future. I come to the next speaker, Dr. Nabinita Rudra. Thank you, Dr. Rudra, for joining us. To introduce Dr. Nabinita Rudra, Dr. Nabinita Rudra is Senior Program Director at Development Alternatives with deep expertise in community-led development, climate resilience, and livelihoods. Dr. Rudra, how, according to you, have the SDGs translated at the community level in India? And where have they produced meaningful change or left critical gaps? Over to you, Dr. Rudra.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I'd like to congratulate Terry for organizing this engaging session. Thank you, Ambassador Puri and Priyambada for setting the context. Development Alternative is pioneering in a pioneering social enterprise. We are committed to advancing the well-being of people, safeguarding the planet, and fostering shared prosperity. So at the heart of our work, building community resilience to climate change remains the most important agenda that we drive. I just like to talk a little about that. Now, to your question, India's SDG adoption has been uneven, and many of speakers have already pointed that out. We have a strong framing and institutional buy-in that's always there, and it has been recognized by different kind of assessments which are happening, and the SDG marks which are coming to India, like India has scored good. But we are weaker on the ground level accountability. There are a couple of instruments like aspirational district program, or you can say block programs, which has been taken up by Niti Aayog. To some extent, it has been central to closing that gap. It has helped in pulling together fragmented sectoral schemes from health to nutrition to livelihood, or you call infrastructure, water sanitation, so on and so forth. It has tried to bring that to a single district level performance framework. And that has streamlined implementation and forced departments to work in convergence rather than in silos. Niti Aayog's SDG India Index has also reinforced this by giving states a common benchmarking lens. But instead of that, when we talk about the Gram Panchayat development plans, we should always think about that, because it has proven an effective convergence tool for convergence at the last mile, which is very important, because I'm coming from the community lens. How community sees is very important. We have seen this architecture drive genuine cross-departmental coordination on ground, yet the persistent gap between policy framing and delivery remains the most real work which lies. At the last mile, if you see, the Gram Panchayat development plans have proved the architecture through which the convergence gets operationalized, but its effectiveness depends heavily on the strength of participatory planning at the village level. And when we say participatory planning is at the village level, civil society actors like development alternatives and others have played critical role here, facilitating village level plans through genuine community participation, integrating them to GPDPs, securing sanctions, and then following through to ensure effective implementation. Civil society organizations are helping communities to negotiate better, which is actually need of the hour. I can just cite that in one block, because of this process, we have been able to construct 283 climate smart infrastructure projects in a span of 2 years. A constant illustration of how participatory planning, where systematically linked to GPDP process, can convert policy intent to ground level assets. I'm sure there will be series of such examples with every CVOs. But what about scaling? Will that be possible without government, which has largest coverage? And unless they adopt those innovations, can that be possible? Despite all, the persistent gap between policy framing and delivery remains where most of the real work lies. And civil society facilitated convergence for its kind offers one of the more replicable models for closing it. At this stage, we must acknowledge that resources for adaptation remain scarce, and many speakers have talked about it. It is amounting to less than 10% of what is required. And this fund is steadily diminishing, a reality every organization like us is struggling with. While funding may be available for mitigation, but absence of solutions for resilience, a critical question: how can safeguarding be assured for people, planet, and prosperity in the changing climate? So there are a couple of gaps. There are major gaps which we can see from the community angle. From my engagement across the country, I could say that the pace of climate integration is still too shallow in most of the district plans. We actually see many of the district plans. Even well-resourced programs often treat SDG 3 as an add-on. Frontline data genuinity remains thin. SDG monitoring is very strong at the aggregate level, but it is very weak where the course correction happens at blocks, at habitations level. If I remember precisely, the work done in a couple of states where we were working as a program management agency for FCDO, the supported infrastructure for climate resilient growth program, some states did really well. Why? Because it required deliberately re-engineering of MG Narega implementation, rather than running a climate resilience as a parallel activity. So these are a couple of challenges. Financing is also a challenge. Many cases, if you see the projects and programs, a couple of agencies are running or government is running, there's an absence of landscape approach. Financing is also on a project cycle. Most development finances, be it bilateral funding, multilateral grants, or philanthropic funding, or a CSR project, they are disbursed in a discrete project cycle, typically for 3 to 5 years. And working with nature is difficult in these cycles. Each cycle has its own design phase, its log frame, its procurement, inception period, so on and so forth. The challenges lie in the fact that institutional capacity, community systems, and behavior change do not operate in short funding timelines. Yet, they are indispensable for building resilience. So there's a huge gap. In that scale, I would like to say that the architecture is more mature. The SDG architecture is more mature than people give it credit for. What is missing is patience, convergent, climate literate implementation at last mile. There's a need to build on institutions that exist before and indicators do. That is what I will like to end my conversation with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rudra. Your insights were really grounded. And yes, there is so much more work that needs to be done, especially when we look at what's really happening at the local level. You highlighted the role of greater climate integration and especially adaptation. According to the report by UN DESA and UN FCCC Synergies platform, about 70%, if we meet all the SDGs, 70% of the SDGs are actually also connected to climate adaptation. And so hence, adaptation is so really, so very important. You also highlighted the role of more strengthening on data systems at the local level, and of course, the role of civil society organizations. So here on the term of CSOs, I do come to the next speaker, Mr. Christopher Garraway from the UN Resident Coordinator's Office in India. Chris, thank you so much for being here. And of course, UNRC has been at the forefront of mobilizing civil society whenever India has had its VNR reports and rounds. So we're very happy to have you here. To introduce Mr. Christopher Garraway, Mr. Christopher Garraway is an economist and development coordination officer at the United Nations Resident Coordinator's Office in India. Chris, the question to you is, how must multilateralism evolve to advance sustainable development in an increasingly fragmented geopolitical landscape? Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Shelley. And a big thank you to Terry, the presentation from Ishita, the introductory remarks from Ambassador Puri, and just the presence of this great panel. I'm learning a lot, and it's a very a wonderful group of folks that you've put together, Shelley. So congratulations to Terry. As usual, a huge and important voice in this important debate. I don't want to take up too much of anyone's time. I just had a couple of thoughts really on kind of two areas that I thought I would try to share with you. One is a bit more about the process, and the other is more on the substance. As Shelley said, I'm an economist with the UN Secretariat. So in the UN Secretariat, of course, we are serving the member states who are going to be negotiating this agenda. I was actually incidentally I've been part of the UN Secretariat for 15 years, and I was actually posted previously in India in 2011 to 2013. So supported then the consultations for the SDGs, and have seen now coming back to India during COVID how the SDGs have been implemented in India and what we can learn from them and what we know about the process. I would say from the UN Secretariat side, and I'm really pleased for the briefing from our co-chair, Professor Kundry, of the GSDR report, and also the great insights from Lynn Wagner on the negotiations. I would from the Secretariat side, there's a piece basically within the Secretariat and of course the broader UN system. There is an interagency task force that has been put together and had its first meeting last month in July. And it's led by, in the Secretariat, DESA, the Department for Economic and Social Affairs, and of course the UN Development Program kind of in terms of the broader system, and they are the interagency task force to support the summit for 2027. And of course, the idea is that they'll bring together all the insights from within the system and how we can support the member states in their negotiation. And as Shaylee pointed out, we in the RC system have we support VNRs and not just CSO consultations, but also all kinds of things from SDG localization. It was really interesting to hear the insights on the other parts of happening, Asia Pacific being ahead of the curve on SDGs. I can say, yes, that's good to hear. And I'm glad I'll tell my other colleagues as well, because we feel it in India. I think the difference between today and 2012 is, while we knew in 2012, 2011, we already had an idea that we were going to consult widely, support the member states in consulting around the world. And I think at the end of the consultations, it was Helen Clark who said, "Oh, we've consulted with 1 million people about what the SDGs should be." So far, we haven't consulted with that many people. We may, but I think one of the interesting things is that actually we don't need to. The UN system itself doesn't need to drive those consultations to the degree to which member states, because of the ownership that exists over the SDGs, are going to be driving those consultations themselves. And so I would just, we had a meeting recently of the UN Economics Network. We were all comparing notes about what our different countries are doing. And I was pleased to point out India's statement at the high-level political forum, which was very short. It was delivered by the mission because the visiting dignitaries couldn't go at the last minute. But it was quite I would say ambitious. It had an ambitious vision for what post 2030 could be. And I would just point out one word in that statement, and that's the word is regenerative. Looking beyond sustainable development. Sustainable development is about net zero. Regenerative development will be about creating positive value. And I think from the environmental perspective, this is easiest to understand. What that means in a social context maybe takes a little bit more discussion and debate, and measurement becomes a really important issue. But I'm really interested to see that kind of thinking going on, not just in India, but around the world. And I think that's where the multilateralist system can also help support that thinking. And I'm really glad some of the presenters earlier mentioned the crises that have happened. And I think for me, that is the lesson that I draw from the SDGs, is we know the SDGs were universal. That was the victory over the MDGs. Universal, they're much more owned for that reason. Because they're universal and collectively owned, they're also much more complex. And we've said since 2015 that they're integrated, but have our policies actually reflected the way that they're integrated? Have our interministerial conversations really reflected how integrated they are? I think COVID-19 was the first real proof that we haven't been thinking in an integrated fashion. And then all the sort of crises that we've seen come along the pike since then have reminded us about how our policymaking apparatus is not equipped for an integrated agenda, from food, fuel, and fertilizers, coming out of the Black Sea, to most recently trying to get around the Straits of Hormuz. So I think this focus on resilience and on how to regenerate development in the face of resilience, I think, is a really live and interesting discussion. And I think the analytical tools are out there and now are beginning to be realized. We've heard many of the speakers talk about systems thinking approaches. This is something, and systems thinking is messy and confusing, and you have to get people in a room who disagree. So I'm looking forward to, if we don't consult with 1 million people, maybe it's slightly less than 1 million, and they're just really smart and have very different points of view. But I trust that the system and the member states will take us in that direction. The other issue I wanted to just raise about the substance has to do with the financing, of course. And I think that we see two areas. And I think it's not such a, we can lament the kind of shift away from aid, but actually in the SDGs, they were supposed to be beyond aid. We were supposed to be working beyond aid since 2015, at least, right? Aid was the focus of the MDGs. So in the decline in official development assistance is a challenge. It's definitely hurting the most vulnerable, for sure. But I think the spirit, and this gets to maybe something what Ambassador Puri was referring to before, at least the way I heard it, the spirit of the Global South has always been one about let's take things and self-reliance. We need to rely on ourselves to a certain extent. And I think in the financing point of view, you see this, it's not just the largest economy in the world that's focusing on trade as a way of financing their development, but actually that has been something that the Group of 77 has been pursuing for 50, 60 years. And if you see, for example, things like the WTO undergoing certain challenges, not being seen as a supranational sort of configuration that can adjudicate and legislate trade among countries, we are seeing the rise of other maybe less legally binding treaties, but equally important frameworks. For instance, the GSTP, the Global System on Trade Preferences Among Developing Countries, is seeing a resurgence in the face of the challenges that we see to the multilateral trading system. And in terms of debt, we see things like the emergence of the Borrowers Club. So we now have a group of developing countries, same way we've had creditors working together for many years, now borrowers are working together. These are encouraging developments to my view. In terms of the last thing I wanted to say about the financing debate, I think one of the big political challenges will be how we address the issue of degrowth. It's been almost a word that we don't like to say at the UN. It is one where there's even really interesting work coming out of the IMF showing that it may not, the idea of energy transition is a challenging one and may actually require demand management from developed countries as well. So how you manage to allow countries to continue to grow, to develop, at the same time that we try to manage what essentially is a growth process that is pushing the planet to its tipping points. This, I think, is the big political debate. And I look forward to the great minds of our different member states and our different constituencies out there getting together and discussing it. Thank you very much again, Shaili, for bringing me into this conversation, and looking forward to the rest of the conversation this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for highlighting several aspects, including the process and substantive aspects. And of course, you did drop a bombshell in terms of degrowth. Of course, when I was a little bit more in, and I think many of us, when we were in more of an idealist space of mind, I almost ended up doing my PhD in that, but nonetheless came down to a little bit more practical concept. But yes, still very important. And ultimately, we can keep talking about ecological limits, and we can keep talking about many other concepts, but we have to talk about these larger paradigms. And thank you for highlighting the need for resilience and regenerative, the concept of regeneration and integrated approaches, including for food, fuel, and fertilizer. So thank you, Chris. Now we come to our final two speakers. And just for those of you who are wondering, just like the SDGs are just 4 years away, the timeline, we have two speakers left. We may not be able to do the second round, but still it was better to have that greater ambition and have that wider perspective and scope, even though we might have not ended up with the exact outcomes which we had envisaged. So nonetheless, over to our next speaker, Dr. Paula von Haaren. And Dr. Paula von Haaren is a senior researcher at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, IDOS, focusing on the health climate nexus and the geopolitics of Beyond 2030 agenda. Welcome, Paula. So the question to you, Paula, is how should the future framework respond to pandemics? We have seen COVID as a big disruptor and one of the causes of the SDGs even sliding back. Conflicts, of course, we had Nilanjan speak about it, and many, and all the speakers actually referred to it. Economic disruptions and other systemic uncertainties. So what do you think, how do you think the future, what is your take on the future framework and it to respond to these disruptions? Over to you, Paula.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation and for the interesting contribution so far. I've been taking a lot of notes. Yeah, so I think there are two ways to approach this question. So on one, I think Dr. Ghosh already named a lot of solutions. How can we address the causes of disruption in the agenda? And that would mean, for instance, strengthening the peace goal, strengthening pandemic resilience, also cooperation during pandemics, for instance. But also, how can we strengthen our systems to become more resilient when crises hit? And that would mean, for instance, to integrate flexible learning from the disruption so that we don't, we change our systems to respond to these disruptions in the future. We also have to analyze the interlinkages between systems to avoid that crises spill from one system over to another. For instance, we saw this in COVID, that it spilled over from the health system to the economic system. We need to encourage long-term planning, and we need to also install early warning systems, for instance. And then I think the second part of the question is that in the midst of all those disruptions, and in the current geopolitical situation, how can we still negotiate a framework that is ambitious? And basically in our current research at IDOS, we map implicit and explicit actor positions on beyond 2030. And we find that there are three stylized positions. So one would be what we coin the consensus position, which means that you essentially continue with the same agenda, you just do some minor changes, maybe in the means of implementation. And this has the advantage that you keep the achievements of the current agenda, you have low transition costs, but it also means that you might have a loss in relevance because you don't really incorporate the lessons learned, you don't incorporate the new topics. And then a second group of countries has, let's say, favors more a focus on the most important or synergistic topics. And some argue that this might make the agenda more relevant or implementable, but the large drawback here would that you could use this to dispose of unwanted goals and topics. And also it's kind of hard to achieve a consensus on what are these most important topics. And then you have multilateral, which either would drop out of the process like the US might, or they might also join the process, even though they don't really believe in multilateral cooperation, but pushing for instance, weakened accountability. And it seems like Russia, for instance, could be one of them and is already creating alliances for this. So what we have to do here is to achieve the impossible. We have to preserve the achievements of the current agenda, which right now there's a majority for just keeping the agenda as it is, or it's easiest to achieve this if we make very little changes or no changes. But we also need an agenda that remains relevant and that has high ownership, because otherwise it'll just be a piece of paper that's not really implemented. And so we see different options how we can achieve that. So we can incorporate new topics, for instance, through strengthening interlinkages between existing topics. We can incorporate new topics through the means of implementation. We might even be able to softly reform the accountability mechanisms and learning, for instance, through peer review. And we have to create long-term ownership by supporting an inclusive negotiation process and also coming up with a narrative that shows the impacts of the agenda on well-being and safety of people on the ground.
Thank you so much. Lala? Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives, and we are very interested, and we'll be, of course, interested to know more about the mapping work that you have done about the explicit and implicit positions of actors, regarding the Agenda 2030, Beyond 2030 agenda. And thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. I now come to our final speaker, Dr. Sabyasachi Saha. Of course, Sabya is very close to where we are. We work out of the same complex. To introduce Dr. Sabyasachi Saha, he is an associate professor at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS, which is an autonomous research institution under the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. And it's a research institution which has been at the forefront of several areas, including development cooperation. We at TERI have had a close cooperation, on the G20 agenda and many other development-related agenda. So always good to have you, Sabya, and we have to do many more things together. And he specializes in technology, trade, innovation, and development cooperation. And at the moment, I'm sure Sabya is very busy with BRICS, of course, completely, just in, the final crucial lap. So, Sabya, my question to you will be, of course, about the BRICS presidency. With India holding the BRICS presidency this year, how do you think BRICS can shape a substantive and distinctive global South contribution to the post-2030 agenda or beyond 2030 agenda, as you would, whatever you would like to refer it? Over to you, Sabya.
Thank you, Shelley, and congratulations to you for this effort in bringing very, very important minds on the subject to deliberate on the future of the SDGs. And I must also acknowledge Ambassador Manjeev Puri, who has brilliantly set the context in the beginning, because it's a lot of issues we have discussed. From geopolitics to regression of SDGs to the progress on localization, etc. And definitely, as colleagues have mentioned, there are very important lessons. Of course, nobody was prepared for the world that we are into today at this point. And since the pandemic years, we are seeing recurring shocks which the SDGs were unable to kind of cope with, despite you having a large 17 goal agenda, including the goal 17 itself, which makes it, it has a multiplier effect on the rest of the SDGs agenda, because unless you can, countries have shown a lot of interest in taking the SDGs agenda forward. And particularly what we have learned in India is quite important in terms of localization. It's a very big country. We're a federal country. State level implementation, Niti Aayog driving several of these initiatives, partnership building, etc. And also the resilience building, where we talk about convergence, where multiple departments of the governments come together, the center and the state governments come together, all of that. And India's own development journey, perhaps, right at the beginning, we said that the SDGs mirror the national development agenda. And from that perspective, in a autonomous process, we have seen what can be achieved through delivering digital technologies at scale, bringing in financial inclusion, bringing women at the center of development, promoting grassroots entrepreneurship, because you need the policy entry points where you connect the three pillars of SDGs and also try to connect the 5 Ps. Although we are going slow on bringing people and planet together, increasingly there is a divergence. But importantly, the partnership building, and this room represents one of those efforts, where, as somebody mentioned, coalition of the willing. So yes, many people are willing, but the structural imbalances are huge at this point. Of course, supply chains, geopolitics, etc. we have discussed, but the legacy institutional architecture, which creates these inequities and imbalances, need to be worked upon. Of course, SDGs had a promise because we thought that once you have a globally agreed agenda, it would naturally feed into the processes of international organizations, regional organizations, etc. And here on, it's automatic convergence. It never happened because you could not deal with the structural imbalances that exist. And on the top of that, we have the new shocks that are there. So definitely we are in a challenging situation, and all points mentioned by colleagues in the room in terms of what is the way forward is important, and we need to deepen this dialogue. Talking about the geopolitics per se, as well as how countries perceive their own partnership building exercise. We know the priorities of the global south. We know the rising potential of the global south. We know the assertiveness of the global south. We know the leadership capabilities of the global south. But you need the institutions to acknowledge, accommodate, and bring all of this together. Uh, at the same time, you need, as we say in economics, I come from this discipline, we are always making rational choices, but rational choices are not always determined through because the capabilities are also determined through the power relations we have. So the world is also quite divided in terms of how unequal power relations are at this point. You have a lot of experiences that has come through. G20 has supported the SDGs agenda quite a lot for many years now. There have been some learnings in the process. India hosted the G20 presidency in 2023. The four global south countries, starting with Indonesia, then India, then Brazil and South Africa. Each of the global south countries brought in a definite framework of reforms in the multilateral agenda that was required, and G20 kind of internalized those priorities, which gives us a lot of hope and lessons. At the same time, you have very large economies also trying to form their own groupings, and quite successful. For example, BRICS, as Shelley mentioned, in these 20 years, BRICS has remained quite strong in terms of how the continuity has been maintained. The leaders meet annually. There is a strong focus on sustainable development. And every presidency brings in their kind of own unique perspectives. We have seen this in the past when India hosted BRICS presidency in 2016, then in 21, and now this year. What we have felt is that there is tremendous experience, expertise, knowledge, and the eagerness to learn, to make development more bottoms up in BRICS, which keeps sustainable development agenda quite relevant within the BRICS framework. At the same time, many of the things that we have discussed in this room today, from finance to technology to capacity building, etc., unless you have this wherewithal in place. So there is a natural inclination in BRICS because several countries now, BRICS is 11-member group, so it has expanded, which itself shows the kind of value that this group brings in terms of promoting South-South cooperation, promoting these knowledge exchanges, which are very crucial for sustainable development. Sustainable development per se within BRICS is quite existential. So there is no debate that there are challenges of covering the last mile or taking the right solutions and the affordable solutions to people, to bring in frameworks that promote access. So these are kind of common thread that countries discuss. BRICS, as you know, is also a very elaborate mechanism. Multiple government departments engage with each other. You have the people-to-people track. So it's quite an elaborate mechanism. And in at all levels, I must say, the urgency for sustainable development is extremely important. Having said that, and my last comment would be, even this year when India is chairing BRICS, the theme of the presidency is building resilience, cooperation, innovation, and sustainability, which itself brings in the core development anchor in multilateral engagement. So the multilateral architecture needs to be built with the development fulcrum. We cannot move away from development. There is always this trade-off, and more increasingly it is being politicized. But at the same time, development remains, and sustainable development in particular remains the anchor. So as I just mentioned, you need the right political will also to reform the institutions, and also bring in the reformed multilateralism kind of an architecture where the imbalances are dealt with. So SDGs may continue in some form beyond 2030. We would pursue the localization agenda because there is no going back on the localization agenda. Several countries would prioritize according to their context, but at the same time, the political will to minimize the imbalances would be very, very important. So these are some of the learnings from India. And as Ambassador Puri mentioned in the beginning, some of our institutions represented here are all very keenly following this debate, particularly connecting with each other on building on the momentum and narrative. And I'm very happy to see colleagues from across the world also joining this. At my institution, we are also spearheading some initiatives. We have been there. I have been there right from Addis and New York, and then HLPF, so all of that, and the G20. But at this point, we are also trying to spearhead some of the future of SDGs debate, connecting with colleagues particularly in Europe, where there is a lot of interest perhaps to look at it, including the recently held Hamburg Sustainability Summit and the all these new commissions, etc., that have been set up. But Global South needs to be in the room and provide the necessary leadership that is required. So with this, I stop and thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Sabir, and I think you ended on the right note with the tag of India's BRICS presidency, which sums it up. I know that I've got a request from a lot of speakers about remaining intervention. We have unfortunately run out of time. I did not stop you. I wasn't strict on time management. I didn't want to be, but we will continue this discussion. We will also be bringing out proceedings, so you can please provide written inputs. But before I close, I will still want to give just for one sentence conclusion, to the final round of mics to all the speakers. But I'm not going to be posing a question, but you can just share any final thoughts from your side, and we can just go in the same round of speakers. So Professor P.B. Kanduri, over to you first.
Thank you very much. An extremely interesting event. We need to focus on building systems transformation pathways, detailed, implementable systems transformation pathways towards what we call, and it has been referred between the panel speakers, towards regenerative resilience for nature, people, and economy. This means that we should bring interdisciplinary science, stakeholder co-design, bankable and scalable finance solutions, and open access platforms combined with capacity building. We should know that once we have these digital global commons that are completely open access and are also analytical, but combining AI and machine learning, and bring all the data, all the models, and all the results, then we can have a huge transparency for each and every country with regards to detailed implementation pathways. The real constraint isn't data or science or technology or even money. It's capacity, transparency, accountability, And importantly, translation of public goals into investable projects, long-term needs into fund-compatible assets, and risks that exist into risks that are priced and allocated. Capital will flow when public goals are translated into bankable, risk-adjusted, investable portfolios that are co-designed and co-owned and shareholdered by the stakeholders. And it is important to provide that sort of structure and analytical power, but also transparency power, so that one can see who is not collaborating and who is creating externalities at the expense of the welfare of others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kunduri. Come to Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh. Over to you for your final words.
Thank you, Shelley. Just allow me 5 sentences here, especially from the perspective of the Global South. And in any case, 2030 cannot be treated as the end of the development journey. We all know that. Now, the next agenda has to build resilient economies, inclusive knowledge societies, innovative institutions, and environmentally secure communities. So first, resilience must become a development outcome, not merely an emergency response. 2, development must move beyond poverty alleviation towards decent living. It has to transcend that stage. The goal has to be decent living and inclusive prosperity. So the objective is not simply larger economies, it's better human lives. 3, global value chains must become development chains. The Global South has too often supplied raw materials while technology, industrial capacity, and value accumulate elsewhere. So we have to transcend that stage. We have to move from extraction to processing, from assembling to design, from technology adoption to technology creation. 4, and perhaps most important, that we must close what we call the ingenuity gap. And ingenuity, as I say, that's essentially the 5th form of capital beyond natural capital, social capital, human capital, and physical capital. It is the capacity to produce actionable ideas to resolve the complex problems of the wicked world. And this gap arises when demand for solutions actually grows much faster than our ability to generate them. And this gap is essentially a gap between the Global South and the Global North. This is not merely a knowledge gap. It is a loss of development agency. So the post-2030 agenda must therefore treat production of ideas as a critical factor of production. So it must invest in research, scientific institutions, critical thinking, and local innovation systems. Digital divide is rapidly becoming an AI divide. So that should be another goal, to close the digital divide. 5th, resilience and ingenuity are impossible without the fiscal space. So between 2022 and 24, developing economies paid, I think, more than 700 billion more in external debt principal and interest than they received in new financing. So the next agenda should support faster restructuring, local currency financing of costs, which BRICS, of course, has come up with, disaster pause clauses, and allocations based on vulnerability. And finally, environmental stewardship, which must extend beyond net zero. So the post-2030 bargain is very clear. Resilience before crisis, decent living beyond minimum survival, value addition before extraction, ingenuity before intellectual dependency, AI capacity before AI dependency, finance before mandates, and most importantly, environmental stewardship with justice and development space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nilanjan. I'd just like to now invite Dr. Lynn Wagner. Dr. Wagner, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you all for this really interesting conversation. I guess I just wanted to close with some thoughts about the importance of justice in this process and the outcomes. In terms of the process, really the collaboration, the transparency, the engagement is very important to be sure that all the voices are heard and that there is ownership of the whatever this new direction will be. And then in terms of outcomes, especially given the importance of implementation, paying attention to the capabilities as well as keeping the principle of no one left behind front and center.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wagner. Over to you, Dr. Lapatu.
Yeah, thank you, Shaili. And I'll just the one thing I wanted to mention. Can you hear me? Because I see that the one thing I wanted to mention is just the fact that we have collected data from our global network on this issue of the priority for post 2030. This is all available in our SDR 2026. There's 6 priorities basically where 75% of our network agree these should be priorities. Number 1 is strengthen the means for implementation, the governance, the science, the data. Number 2 is the reform of the global financial architecture. Number 3 are guidelines around SDG synergies and trade-offs. Number 4, better reflection of those international spillovers, notably those spillovers embodied into unsustainable consumption that can lead to deforestation and GHG emissions in other parts of the world. And then goals on AI for sustainable development. And the experts tell us the goals and targets should remain fairly similar. So overwhelmingly, the message here is that the focus should be on implementation, not on revamping the whole set of goals and targets. And then 2 quick points. I completely agree with what's been said about the leadership of the BRICS. We also believe that many of those transformations require, of course, cooperation, but regional cooperation should play a bigger role. We just hosted a major conference on ASEAN and Greater Bay Area of China cooperation on energy decarbonization. When we talk about the energy transformations or even the digital transformations, there's a lot of benefits in collaborating with your neighbors, actually. And so we feel at SDSN that the next era of sustainable development, yes, there are challenges that are global, some are national, some are local, but the regional aspect should also be emphasized. The EU, the African Union, and ASEAN, and all those regional groupings have a big role to play. Final point in my field on the research, the science, and so on. A lot of the research and science is there. They need to be translated into practical tools and instruments. And I think there's still a bit of work to be done. Phoebe is doing a lot of work on this. We try also at SDSN to translate those academic papers and those models and so on into things that can be actually useful for governments. And that's at the heart of our mission at SDSN and at the heart of the mission of the center that I lead, the SDG Transformation Center, where we work with governments on practical pathways where we turn the science into actual policy tools and instruments. I'll stop here again. Major thank you to Terry, and I hope we can keep in touch, of course, in the coming months and years. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And we do hope that we can stay in touch. Over to you now, Dr. Eric Sussman.
Yeah, thank you so much. And once again, just to reiterate, huge thanks to Terry for organizing this. I'm going to raise 3 key points. The first one is I agree wholeheartedly with the sentiment that's been expressed that we don't want to reopen the goals and the targets up because that might lead to more regression than progress. At the same time, I think we need to consider thoughtfully how we strengthen text that surrounds the SDGs to consider issues that haven't been included in the current SDGs. So that might include things obviously like emerging AI debates, but also there's issues like air pollution that are not front and center in the SDGs. And this is from my perspective, the largest environmental threat to human health. So how do we get those issues a little bit more prominently featured, even though they're not, having their own goal? This is one point. The second point is I think we need to focus a lot more when we talk about implementation and also on the scaling piece on South-South collaboration. I think there's a lot that can be learned across countries in the Global South, and that type of mechanism can be strengthened. And the third point I want to raise is one of the things I've liked so much about today's event is it gives us a real opportunity to share amongst each other, what people are thinking on the post-2030 SDGs. And I don't think we've had enough of that type of exchange so far. And I would encourage, I don't know if it's Terry or maybe collectively, I think there's an opportunity here to have sort of rather than just a listing of different people's inputs, maybe some type of like a set of perspectives on the post-2030, short art. I don't want to call them articles, but 1 or 2 pagers that basically share different perspectives from different viewpoints on the post 2030 that help raise greater awareness. I've been delighted to see that there's, about 300 people that have joined us today, but I think there's a global audience for this type of discussion, and I hope we can raise the profile of this work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eric. Over to you, Dr. Rudra.
Thank you, Sally, for this opportunity. There are quick points. The first point I would like to say that post-2030 framework must build on institutional and social diagnostic, not retrofitted indicators. And it should integrate insights from landscape level mapping of risk, opportunities, indigenous knowledge, and community realities. Should proceed and the target setting. The second point I want to mention that convergence has to be structured. This cannot be aspirational, right? The convergence happens because of strong community institutions. Hence, in post-2030, targets should encourage financing instruments built to fund outcome bundles, not sectoral silos, and they specifically should invest in building capacities of local institutions, which is very important. The third point I wanted to mention, though many speakers have said so, that among many gaps, gender equality and social inclusion needs urgent attention. So the agenda should actually say LNOB, leave no one behind, must fund block and habitation level desegregated as data standards, not an optional add-on. The fourth point which I wanted to mention is technology integration and evidence-based delivery. Actually, failures also need to be studied as a rigorously as success. Now, another things which I wanted to mention is inclusive governance, dedicated seat for grassroots organizations in global coalitions like ENACT. It happened in ENACT in COP30. Formal recognition to community knowledge in adaptation and biodiversity planning, ensuring local priorities shape the global agendas. And the single most shift, which I think that local institutions should hold the data and decision rights, not just implementation responsibility. This is all I wanted to mention quickly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Navneeta Rudra. Over to you, Chris. Mr. Chris Carroll, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Shelley, and thanks, colleagues. Just quickly, whether it's continuing the SDGs or going to something more ambitious, regenerative resilience, whatever you want to call it, or hammering down more specifically on implementation and financing, I think the core agenda of the SDGs can be summed up sort of in three ideas. One is about narrowing inequalities, one is about transforming systems, and one is also about expanding rights in order to leave no one behind. And I hope that that continues to be at the core of what we as an international community curate as a development agenda going forward. And I would just lend my agreement to the suggestion by Professor Eric, I believe, about, this is a great discussion. It's one of the first open consultations that I've taken part in about this. I would just encourage Terry and others to keep feeding the space. As I said before, the UN is happy to always curate these discussions, but I think it's the best when it comes from the ground up and from all the different stakeholders out there. So thanks again, and really appreciate it. Thanks, Shirley, colleagues.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and completely agree. We are very willing, and we would definitely like to collectively take this forward with all of the colleagues who are part of this webinar. So I come to Paula, Dr. Paula Owenhart.
Thank you. Yeah, I would make 2 points, or maybe 3. Firstly, that we have to really preserve the achievements and principles of Agenda 2030, that we have to, at the same time, increase relevance. I think Eric Sussman coined it very nicely that we can do this in the surrounding text. And I would just add that we have to combine it with ownership building also. And then second of all, we should address resilience in the framework, including, and I'm sneaking in here an answer to my second question, it wasn't asked, including incorporating the climate health nexus. So making the health sector more climate friendly and more resilient also to climate change and extreme weather events. On this, we also have some upcoming research work. And then thirdly, I would say, act now and join the discourse now, because there are some countries who are already joining the discourse. And yes, we do not want this discourse to be dominated by less progressive views, but we would like it to take up the issues that we want to see in it. And so there's really a value in bringing our ideas out now rather than instead of later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. Now coming to Sabya, Dr. Sabyasachi Saha, over to you. Yeah, I think Sabya is not. So I think we will close the discussions here, but I just wanted to, I don't want to attempt to like sum it up, but we've come across very useful perspective. We will, we will summarize it, we'll document it. We will also, invite you to disseminate the webinar, which is also a link of it will be available on Terry's YouTube channel, but also its key takeaways. And we will, of course, would love to love that if we could co-create code, if we could just come up with a joint policy brief or even a two-pager with all of us, like putting out key messages that has come across. We will be happy to draft it based on the discussions that we have seen in this webinar and share it with you, with of course a timeline to provide any inputs and consent if you would want your name to be included, and we will circulate it to our wider audience. And of course we would request you to also amplify the same through your networks. And we would be very happy to be a part of this momentum building. And of course, this was a small, humble step, but happy to continue this and build on larger endeavors with more stakeholders around across. And with this, I come to the final segment, of course, handing it over to Priyambada, who has, of course, been in touch with you. She has been the webinar coordinator. And so now over to you. Over to my colleague, Ms. Priyambada Upadhyay, to deliver the vote of thanks and then, of course, close the webinar. Over to you, Priyambada.
Thank you, Dr. Kedia. On behalf of Terry, I extend our sincere thanks to all our speakers, panelists, and participants for joining us today for this timely discussion on Agenda 2030 and beyond. As we conclude, I would like to express our heartfelt gratitude to everyone who contributed to the success of this webinar. A special thanks to Dr. Viva Dhawan, Director General Terry, for her continued guidance and support in advancing Terry's work on sustainable development and multilateralism, and for her encouragement in bringing this webinar together. We are grateful to Ambassador Puri for his insightful opening remarks and to our distinguished speakers and panelists for sharing their valuable perspectives and enriching this discussion. Here I acknowledge Professor Dr. Phoebe Kondori, Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh, Dr. Lynn Wagner, Dr. Guillaume Lafortune, Dr. Navadita Rudra, Dr. Eric Zisman, Mr. Chris Garraway, Dr. Paula von Harren, and Dr. Sabyasachi Saha. A special word of appreciation to Dr. Shaili Keria for expertly moderating the panel, and to Ms. Ishita Srivastava for her thoughtful framing presentation. I also acknowledge the dedicated efforts of Terry's IT cell, communications team, and the events team, whose support ensured the smooth conduct of today's webinar. Finally, thank you to all our participants for your time, engagement, and thought-provoking questions. A brief summary of the discussion will be uploaded on Terry's website on the event page. We hope that you continue joining us in our future engagements. We look forward to your valuable inputs and suggestions. Thank you once again, and have a wonderful day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a nice night, everybody.
Thank you.